Hello all, and this video is going to be picking up on the ontological discussions and topics really to do with philosophy of language, but of course to continue here, you could really say that structuralism goes into many different domains and disciplines and has an influence in the likes of psychology with Piaget, the Swiss psychologist, and of course for this video it primarily has to do with universals in linguistics and the structures, and so really with Piaget in the psychological development, he sees these preset stages in cognition for the development really of a gradual process amongst adolescents, that he looks for the structures and the growth in brain development. And so there's this pre-established structure in that development, and just as an aside, it's kind of interesting to see someone like Piaget and the great German mystic Rudolf Steiner to compare, because obviously they would make for a very strange conversation. They likely wouldn't have very much in common, but I think it's interesting to look at Rudolf Steiner's look at the etheric body and these transformations of the human body. He has a really interesting look at just the human body in general, where they're like reverse plants, where the brain is actually like a plant that's moving downwards, growing downwards, and so the limbs and everything that complements from the brain, and so he has these different stages that are really compelling to consider in your own experiences with such as hitting puberty, or these different landmarks in life in these stages. And with that, you have these different perspectives, even different sensations, as it were, to how the body interacts just amongst itself even. And it's interesting to see how there definitely is a gradual process, a gradual development that they both agree on, despite having far different ramifications, such as Steiner having an entire mystical system, whereas psychology and the cognitive analytical tradition would have a much different demand here. But moving along with structuralism, where I was getting perhaps too far ahead of myself there, Chomsky, of course, is famous for his structure in linguistics. And so Chomsky, he has this comparison of the surface structure, as we'll get into with some of the other thinkers, and this depth structure. And so Chomsky does an investigation on a universal structure, a sort of Kantian universal principle, if you will, that could be shared among all different human languages. And so Chomsky, of course, is very influential towards linguistic structuralism. But if we were going to look now at De-sassure, who has a rather interesting look at language differences, And for De-sassure, there's arbitrary assigned words in language that are interrelated, and so you get a variety of different languages in that sort of linguistic usage, and so there's different, not just languages, but different relationships between those words and how we structure and, of course, creatively, categorically look at these, look at things in general. And so the way we go about the world and the structure of that experience gives it its meaning. And so, for example, the positivist movement with science as such, in this positivist focal point, if you will, this lens that constructs the very worlds of positivist experience to be had as such. And so there's no fixed meanings or universal conceptions, there's no logical entities to refer to, but only in these particulars of empirical sensory data reorganized in ways that language is then used upon. And so he has a different Kantian lens insofar as Chomsky actually did an investigation on universal structures. Here we see a very different attitude, but nonetheless a shade of neo-Kantianism, with how there's these structured language grids which are imposed in a sort of a priori way. And just as an aside here, when you talk to people who speak multiple languages, they don't just talk about just using the language and communicating, but actually thinking like a person who's actually embedded and actually within the use as a person, as an identity even, in that language. And so you see this here with how language helps see the world, and so these different languages will have different perspectives, and so there's none that's identical to the real world, and by virtue language structure experience, so we don't actually have a full apprehension or a total reality, if you will, but we do have these different linguistically imposed grids that give forth to us possible experience empirically inputted. And it's interesting to perhaps look at my Aristotelian videos and discussions on race as well on the channel, with language use and its commonality applied to how techniques insofar as the internet currently, not just in communications, but and actually creatively how we have these new dialectics really as a global village, as in many regards as consumers of globalized and capital products, but nonetheless there is a sort of language forming with internet usage, and of course the meanings of memes, and how if you aren't familiar with them, you're kind of left out of this language game despite looking at the same image that everyone else is looking at. And of course this goes beyond just the more traditional or even forgotten relationship with the soil around them, in that the environment, and how a language could be structured in this sense of a language giving a perspective of a people. And so begs the question of are we being alienated perhaps from actually having these shared perspectives instead of really flattening them and becoming this sort of global project, this global village that someone like Marshall McLuhan would critique insofar as how it identity is flattened in order to break away from this relationship from these from the soil that gives perspective, and how that's perhaps lost, or how as we take and move these presuppositions with something like the sciences, or our views of nature even, and how this shift, and then things are broken off, and the sort of Heideggerian truth is aletheia sense. But I digress here and move along to then, of course, in the European tradition, as we've covered on the channel, you have deconstruction with Derrida and the French postmodern movement of undoing the structuralist analysis. And so the deconstruction of verbal schemes to show it's incomplete and thus non-universal. Language dominates experience and privileges. And so there's a linguistic element of relativism, of course, that shows. And one could say that the deconstructionist is actually only looking at that surface structure as De-sassure would, and someone like Chomsky would say that no, there's actually a greater depth here. But moving on to our next thinker in this discussion, I wanted to look at Nelson Goodman. And so he follows in the nominalist and Quine tradition of structured experience applied to a philosophy of science. And so scientific theory is language, and so if you have alternative scientific languages, alternative scientific theories, these are incommensurable, as McIntyre describes in Ethics. This applies here and is used as such for the translatability of different scientific theories and their descriptions of, on a metaphysical basis, if you will. And so you can't, measure the truth of one with another. It's just simply incoherent. But nonetheless, multiple theories, multiple pictures can also have truth to them. And of course, there's a influence here to the likes of Richard Rorty and the postmodern thought of truth not just being a singular narrative, but a plurality and a multiplicity, if you will, of these different signs and different demands of what truth in theory actually could be in practice. And so science is tracing and links of making overall alternative sense. So theories are symbols and not descriptions. Science then is much like aesthetics in works of art. And this is very interesting that Goodman would play with this kind of idea of science being much like art, in how there's a creation of worlds here in that Heideggerian sense of taking the earthly and re-territorializing it into the artist's world, into the world of the Platonic ideals, if you will. And so it's interesting to see him apply that with science in an unlikely position, to where perhaps someone like Spangler, who sees science and art as far more antagonistic. In fact, science is the sterilization really of high cultural forms, because it's it's privileged as such, and the ramifications, of course, for technology, and that sort of pragmatic sense of using scientific theory and replacing art and sterilizing objects into simply being reserved hands of future technological use or creativity even. And so a correct scientific picture moving along then has coherence and an adequate scope in a unified fashion, enabling us to talk about data and simplicity. So of course, you don't want to have a theory that cannot really just be applied in a simpler way, perhaps more than just trying to get your scientific theory across to a commoner. It's more about the demand of actually being able to use empirical data prudently in actually describing and using your theory. If it's a coherent theory, it should be able to appear not just in 4D giga-chad discourse on some esoteric topic. You should be able to actually simplify it and be able to have it translated in that sort of fashion. And so clearly we can see here with Goodman, we have this anti-realism streak in the philosophy of science, which of course influences the likes of Richard Rorty, as I mentioned earlier. He has an interesting look of nature as a mirror. And so the mirror really is representational insofar as it's actually how Locke would look at nature and its theory of mind, and as such the foundationalism to come out of that from that look of nature as mirror. And so the relativity of all structures of our ideas and concepts sees philosophy as not an access to the ultimate truth or ultimate reality, or even in and of itself, but a pragmatic conversation. But nonetheless, it still can't be translated, and you can't just have two theories standing side by side and have a real rubric for how there's these different even language structures and games within these theories to be able to judge them is really missing the point. But now for the realism retort, Hilary Putnam has an alternative for how constructs are possible in scientific theory, but wants to retain, that there is, real knowledge, hard knowledge of, despite the fact that there is revisions even in something like foundationalism. And so, for Putnam, the realistic approach to theoretical science, our constructs aren't just conventions and just some abstract realm, but in realism justified through our firm knowledge of observations of material identities, or entities, and so the firmly known or given data, as it were, such as in his examples of electrons, of force fields, it's kind of interesting to perhaps see how he says given data it has these Faustian elements to him, of course, which makes all the sense in the world considering this is Western civilization, but spatial magnitudes as well included into that. And so theoretical frameworks are intended to be statements about reality, and so science can be taken realistically in this provisional way. And so in his classification of natural kinds of things, these are objectives, not simply just this linguistic structure, but objectively are a species, a classification. And so, he has a realistic look at, generalities, really, of general principles or publicly recognized observations, and as such, isn't all just a nominal creation. There are hard evidence out there, hard truths, a state of affairs, if you will, that can be inferred from a more hardened sense. These thinkers here all have different outlooks towards the realism, anti-realism debate of structures and the philosophy of language that I wanted to share here. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will be back for my third installment on possible world metaphysics. So I hope you guys look forward to that one as well.